Welcome into the Still Curtain podcast. It is the second edition of our early week episodes. I'm Josh Yourish with you, this time on a Tuesday instead of a Monday, obviously because of the long holiday weekend. Hopefully everyone got some rest, some relaxation, and, it's a restful time for the Pittsburgh Steelers, even though they're in OTAs. Not a ton of news to get to. So we're going to hit on what news there was, what news there is, and bring on Tommy Jaggi later in the show to break down the skill positions with our offseason roster doctor and assess the long-term health and viability of that position group going forward for Omar Khan's roster construction. Before that, we have a couple of news pieces that I'm going to take you through, and that's starting with the Steelers' new linebacker, and that is Patrick Queen. Patrick Queen this offseason signed a pretty lucrative contract with the Pittsburgh Steelers, but it came out in an interview that Queen said he took a fairly substantial $4 or $5 million per year pay cut to join the Steelers because he wanted to, quote, win right now. That was his thought process, that he can get paid later. He's still a very young player coming over from the Baltimore Ravens, of course, but he wanted to come to Pittsburgh to win right now. And that kind of prompted the question in my mind, should the Steelers still be viewed as that type of destination? They certainly were in Ben Roethlisberger's prime with Mike Tomlin, who's a player's coach everybody loves. And maybe that's the simple answer, is guys want to play for Mike Tomlin. Mike Tomlin has never had a losing season. So win right now means be competitive, play for a guy that almost everyone in the league says they want to play for, take a little bit of a pay cut to do so. And maybe this is Queen posturing a little bit in the offseason after getting a deal that's below what he was expected to in the market. And looking at that Patrick Queen contract, I didn't want the Steelers in free agency to go out and splurge for a middle linebacker, an off-ball linebacker. That's just not a very valuable position. And you can just look at the market. There's Fred Warner, there's Roquan Smith, there's a couple of top-tier guys who are getting paid like elite defensive players. But beyond that, it's a drop-off. There's a chasm to the next group. And Patrick Queen kind of falls in the middle. And he got a lot better in Baltimore when Roquan Smith got there. So maybe the league just viewed him as, okay, he's a middle tier off-ball linebacker. He's not the elite of the elite, and that's why he was cheaper, and now he's spinning it to win right now. But it's still worth looking at this question of, should the Steelers be viewed as that type of destination, as a place to come and contend, to really contend for a Super Bowl? Because that's a lot different than contending for second in the AFC North, third in the AFC North, and a wild card spot. Because we all know it's been a long time since the Steelers have won in the playoffs. 2016 was the last time. And 2017, that team was even better. That team looked like a Super Bowl contender and maybe one of the Super Bowl favorites. And then, of course, we know what happened with Ryan Shazier. So the Steelers, ever since Shazier's injury, right when he was looking like maybe the defensive player of the year, he was incredible that season before he got hurt. The team looked like a Super Bowl contender, and they just couldn't fill that spot, because how can you in the middle of the year after the trade deadline? There's no option to fill that. And the Steelers got beat by the Jaguars 45-42 in a ridiculous game that nobody in Pittsburgh likes to acknowledge or think about, as they were looking ahead to the Patriots later in the playoffs. But that's the last time they were a contender. Ryan Shazier's injury knocked them really out of contention, because without him, they weren't a Super Bowl caliber team. And they've been chasing the Shazier replacement ever since, trading up for Devin Bush, taking different swings with different linebackers last year, Cole Holcomb and Landon Roberts, and just trying to fill this position. It feels like it's been a long time that the Steelers have been taking these different swings. They finally have a guy that they feel good about in Patrick Queen. And ironically, the rest of the roster is no longer in Super Bowl contention, right? They finally filled this missing piece they felt like was keeping them from competing for a Super Bowl for years. Whether that's true or not, it isn't, by the way. And he says, that very player says, I came here to win right now. And yet the Steelers aren't in a position to do that. This isn't a team that can win right now. I talked about last week on last week's show, and if you didn't hear it, go back and listen. We went through the quarterback room, the Steelers quarterback room, and the health of that position, like we're going to do with the wide receivers, running backs, tight ends later on in the show. And I said I like where the Steelers are at because they're flexible, right? They have a solid roster. They've invested heavily, maybe too heavily, on the defensive side of the ball, but heavily on one side of the ball where they should have an elite unit. Questionable if the defensive line is good enough to be elite, but it was a good unit last year. And now this missing piece that they've wanted to fill says, I'm here to win a Super Bowl, and they aren't ready to because they don't have a quarterback. They don't have Big Ben anymore. Kenny Pickett didn't work out. This isn't a situation. Yes, Russell Wilson has won a Super Bowl. He's not that type of quarterback anymore. I talked about that last week as well. So Patrick Queen saying, I want to come to Pittsburgh to win. If that was his priority, maybe he should have gone somewhere else. And maybe it didn't line up in free agency and you don't know what offers are out there. And that's why it's easy for him to spin this narrative after he comes in below market value that he wanted to come to Pittsburgh to do some winning. A good old Mike Tomlin 9-10 win season. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about competing for a Super Bowl like he was and should have been doing in Baltimore. And that's not where this team is at. That's not the timeline of this team right now. And it can be concerning if the decision makers, which I don't think Omar Khan is thinking this way, but if the decision makers for the Pittsburgh Steelers are saying, we want Patrick Queen in here because we think we can win right now. That's why we're overpaying. We're paying a lot. Overpaying might not be the right word, but why we're paying a lot, a surplus, to a position that's just not very valued across the league. I'm not so sure that the league should continue to view the Steelers in that light because they never tore it down to the studs. They never traded TJ Watt. They never traded Cam Hayward. They kept the same head coach. It didn't look like the Steelers went through a rebuild, but they did. It was a competitive rebuild, and I feel like with the way Omar Khan has been drafting and maneuvering the quarterback room, they're starting to come out the other side of it and will be a more competitive team this year than last. But this is a team that's just coming out of a rebuild, not a team that's ready to win right now like Patrick Queen thinks they are, and like the Steelers have been trying to do, hunting for that Ryan Shazier replacement for a long time. Hopefully Queen works out. It all works out. The Steelers can compete while he's on his contract. But I think the league has a different perception of the Steelers than the reality of the situation. The league looks at Mike Tomlin as somebody who puts you in contention every year. And the reality is the Steelers haven't been a contender since 2017, since before they lost their middle linebacker. Now they have one, but I still don't think this team is going to be ready to actually contend. Their win total is only at 7.5, as we talked about last week. There's juice to the over, of course, because it's Mike Tomlin. He's going to win some games. We haven't seen a playoff win in a really, really long time. And I don't think Patrick Queen's the type of player that's going to get them over the top. So maybe his idea of win right now, if that's really what he wanted to do, maybe he should have looked elsewhere. but it's good on the Steelers for leveraging Tomlin's reputation to get players like that to still take a pay cut, the way a Joe Hayden did when he came from the Browns to the Steelers, right? That was coming from the Browns, who were the little brother and getting stomped on all the time. Patrick Queen is kind of doing the opposite. Baltimore's been the one that's actually contending out of the AFC North, actually looks like a Super Bowl team out of the AFC North, and now he switched allegiances. But he may have to wait around a little bit to finally get that Super Bowl before he goes off to get his payday like he said he wants to. Hey, Steelers fans, if you think the Steelers are going to be a Super Bowl contender, you think I'm wrong. Maybe you think I'm an idiot, which is fair. And the Steelers are going to contend for a Super Bowl. Well, maybe go check out the DraftKings Sportsbook and look at the Steelers over-under. Look at the Super Bowl odds, the AFC North odds, whatever you want to look at, because DraftKings is offering a no-sweat bet sign-up bonus for new users. New customers who sign up with code FSBETS and deposit at least $5 will receive a no-sweat bet up to $1,500 bonus on their first wager. This means if you place a first bet of $50 and you lose, you will receive a $50 credit in bonus bets straight to your account. That's up to $1,500. So you can take a big swing, and if you miss on it, you lose that bet, you can get it right back in credits. You will also receive one single game parlay reward every day using our code FSBETS. Not only gets you those bonuses, but it also directly supports our podcast. So make sure if you sign up, you use the code FSBETS. If you've been considering signing up for DraftKings, make sure to use that code. That's FSBETS to maximize your winnings. DraftKings new customers get a no sweat bet up to $1,500, a single game parlay bonus every day of the NBA playoffs. Use the promo code FSBETS. And now, before we get into the next topic, the offseason roster doctor, if you will, that we've been playing and we're going to keep playing through the offseason because it's important to look at the Steelers roster. Let's look at really the only roster move that this team has made. And I'm not going to try to make a mountain out of a molehill because it's May, because we're coming off Memorial Day weekend, because there's not all that much to talk about with the NFL at this moment. But I think it was an interesting addition to the Steelers roster. So we'll get into it right now. The Steelers add LaMichael Pirine, a veteran running back, originally out of Florida. He spent some time with the Jets and with the Kansas City Chiefs last year. Not a big factor on that team, but he's a depth running back that the Steelers are adding, and it makes you wonder how Omar Khan, how Mike Tomlin, how this front office regards the running back position. And obviously that's something we'll get into, but Najee Harris didn't have his fifth-year option picked up. I think that was the right move by the Steelers to say, we never should have drafted a running back in the first round. Anyways, that was a Kevin Colbert move. Omar Khan was the cap guru then, right? He wasn't the head honcho. He wasn't the decision maker. Now he is, and he says, he kind of lets you know that maybe he wouldn't have taken Harris back in that draft because he doesn't want to commit to him for the fifth-year option, and I think that's the right decision. But Harris is somebody he's part of the running back revolution, if you will. He's been an outspoken member of that group that thinks running backs need to be paid. Running backs are underpaid in the league. And Najee Harris has been outspoken about that. He's been unhappy about that. He seems a little bit disgruntled showing up to OTAs. He's there. So it isn't a situation. We're not getting a Lev Bell situation, who Lev Bell and Antonio Brown showing up to Lev Bell's boxing match together in Steelers stuff. Ridiculous, when both spurned the team and now they're trying to reclaim their identity as Steelers after leaving for ridiculous reasons in the middle of actual Super Bowl contention. But that's an aside and a rabbit hole we're not going to go down. We're going to stick on this LaMichael Pirine edition because the Steelers running back room's kind of in an interesting spot, right? It's going to be Najee and it's going to be Warren. Najee's not signed after the year because he had that 5th-year option declined. Jaylen Warren is a restricted free agent after 2024. Cordero Patterson, actually kind of a kick return specialist who I think could be an impactful player because of the new kickoff return rules. He signed a 2-year deal this offseason, but they're not really tied to him long term. So there's a lot of flexibility in the running back room as well, like there is the quarterback room. So La'Mical Perine's not going to be a big factor. He probably won't even make the team. But it's interesting that that's the position the Steelers want to add to in this offseason. They also have Dawan Edwards, the Georgia rookie running back in there. Perine is somebody that might be Najee Harris insurance. If Najee is actually a little bit more upset about having his option declined, if there aren't short-term, low-risk extension conversations going on this offseason, which I can't imagine that there are between Harris and the front office. So Perine over his career, 94 carries, 340 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3.6 yards per carry, kind of a short yardage back. He's, again, not going to make a big impact on this team, but maybe there's a little bit more there to the Najee Harris situation. Maybe Arthur Smith is leaning Jaylen Warren a little bit more. And maybe that's something to monitor after this offseason signing. Likely not a big deal. More of a molehill than a mountain, if you will. But something to monitor in a time when there aren't a lot of transactions happening. There's not a lot of roster movement. And to get into that running back room and the wide receiver room, the skill positions, which is the heart of our conversation today, it's time for me to welcome on Tommy Jaggi of the Still Curtain podcast. Welcome on to my show this time, Tommy. I was so lucky to be able to join you and Shane a few weeks back before the NFL draft. And now I'm excited to have you on this platform so we can talk about the skill positions with the Steelers.
Well, Josh, I've been loving your show, doing a great job so far, and thanks for having me on today.
Of course, really appreciate it. So before we get into that, obviously, as you know, I have some requirements as a host. So if you are a fan of Pittsburgh Steelers football, if you're a fan of my show, if you're a fan of Tommy's show, if you're a fan of us getting on together and would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate your support. And now, Tommy, we're going to get into the skill positions. I kind of told you the premise you heard last week, talking about the quarterbacks. How viable is the position room long term? What's at the heart of the question for me with the Steelers skill positions is, will George Pickens be a true number one wide receiver? What say you?
I think that he has the upside. I've thought that from day one. Look, Josh, I thought from watching him as a freshman at Georgia that he was going to be a future number one wide receiver in the National Football League. I don't think the question is talent related at all. I think it's all about Pickens, his attitude, how he's willing to show up, how he handles things. If he goes a game without getting a target, or if he's only targeted 2 or 3 times, can he get past that enough to say, all right, I'm still the top dog here. I'm still the number one guy. I think it's a matter of keeping his head on straight, if you will, at times, and keeping his emotions in check. Talent wise, I think that there's very little that he can't do. Yes, he needs to improve as a route runner. There's obviously a refinement that needs work there. But in terms of catching the ball in traffic, making plays down the field, and even the run after the catch stuff that we didn't see a lot early in his NFL career and during his college career, we saw that a lot more last year. Like that, he doubled in that area of his game. And so I think that he has the potential to be that X receiver that you filter all of your targets through and your offense through. But I think that's mostly up to him.
And that's something that's big in an Arthur Smith offense. That's something everyone's been talking about this offseason is Arthur Smith likes to have his one go-to guy. And that might be why the Steelers haven't made much movement, haven't been aggressive in hunting down wide receiver 2 or whatever that is. So looking at some of the Pickens numbers from last year, Tommy, he was 21st in yards per route run, 205, 31st in yards after the catch per reception at 6.1, which is something you talked about, which was a big surprise, especially in a Matt Canada offense that for most of the year, at least, that didn't generate space for the wide receivers to run. It's a lot of comebacks on the outside. We don't need to talk about how terrible the Matt Canada offense is, of course. And 21st in average depth of target, 20% of his targets were 20 yards downfield. So how do you see Arthur Smith using Pickens in this new offense? Because I think of the AJ Brown role from Tennessee. I think Tennessee is much more instructive to know what you're getting from Arthur Smith than Atlanta ever was. But what do you think about that role for Pickens?
Yeah, I think you have to look at Arthur Smith's history so far and what we saw with him during his 2 years as offensive coordinator in Tennessee. It was the way he used AJ Brown. And then these past 3 seasons in going out and getting a guy like Drake London, who wasn't there that whole time, but the guy that you funnel the targets through. I think he's going to be used as the X. I know there's a lot of people debating, is he going to stay at Z? I think he's the X because that's how the number one guy has always been in Arthur Smith's offense. And I think that there are questions obviously that remain outside of that, but I think it's not that big of a deal because we look at his history. It's you have your number one guy who the offense is funneled through, and then you have everybody else, and everybody else is probably going to be getting 25 to 45 receptions, and Pickens is going to be that guy. So I think so much of the team's success on offense this year will rely on his health because the depth of the position is obviously concerning. And do you have another guy that can step into that primary receiver role, that X role that I think Pickens is going to be playing this year? I think that's the biggest question.
Do you see Pickens as the type of separator that can take on a full route tree and get open quickly enough? Because the big problem that I talked about last week with Wilson and Fields is they hold on to the ball so much. They take a ton of sacks. They keep you off schedule. Deontay Johnson was kind of going to be a perfect solution for those guys because he separates so quickly. Do you think Pickens can introduce some of that into his game? Because, I mean, the contested catch numbers weren't massive for last year, but that's his profile, right? He's not a huge separator.
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest questions remaining in his game. It's the refinedness as a route runner. Can you instead of not round those routes off? Like I think the problem with Pickens is he knows how talented he is, and he knows that he doesn't need a lot of space to be successful. Like the guy's averaging 9.5 yards a target in his career so far, which is amazing considering who the quarterbacks have been and who the offensive coordinator has been. But he does need to work on getting actual separation, running routes harder, selling with head fakes, that kind of stuff. I think the potential is there. There's nothing to say, nothing to limit him athletically from doing so. It's just a matter of just kind of refining that part of his game. But I do think that that's a legitimate question and one that needs to be answered when you're going into year 3 now. I know he's a young guy still, but you're going into year 3. You have to show significant improvement in that regard. And so can he be that separator? I don't know. I think the jury's still out on that. Can he still be a number one receiver type without having that? I think he could because he's that talented at the catch point and he's that physically gifted. But I think having that level of separation would take his game to a whole nother level.
I think to answer my own question, I see Pickens being fine as the number one, especially in an Arthur Smith run heavy offense. I don't know that he could be in every type of offense, but that's fine because we don't have to test that theory. My concern with Pickens more is, do we commit ourselves long-term as a team when you're the Steelers front office talking, obviously, to another mercurial receiver who maybe has that diva tag? There's no good way to answer that question. Like, will he behave himself essentially off the field or even on the field? But that's a concern and something you have to factor in. It seems like it's something the Steelers went away from in this draft, right? They went with Roman Wilson, the Michigan man, and we'll start talking about wide receiver 2 position. It seems like they're moving away a little bit from those mercurial, hyper-talented guys and into a kind of new philosophy with Roman Wilson. Do you think Roman Wilson is going to be that reliable number 2 next to the mercurial Pickens?
That is a hard question to answer right now, but I do like Roman Wilson a lot. I had a 2nd round grade on him coming out. If you look at Marcus Mosier's draft expert consensus board, which takes the average rankings of all the top draft experts, he was the 46th overall player. The Steelers got him at pick 84. I think the value was tremendous there. And so I think that he is going to be a guy who does most of his damage from the slot or is more efficient from the slot probably than he is on the outside, just because of size limitations. I don't think he is the most refined route runner. He kind of rounds his routes off a little bit. Very sure-handed, though. There's a lot of things to like about his game. I think he would be best, honestly, as a wide receiver 3 to begin his career, and then see if it transpires into something where, yes, you could be that number 2. Very different than Deontay. Like these guys win in different ways. He's not going to be that guy that is going to be the elite separator before the catch. And if he does, it's a lot of times it's going to be with speed and just outrunning guys and that are covering him. But I think that there's a chance that he could be that number 2 weapon that they're looking for.
So let's play, since you're saying starting as a wide receiver 3, and that might be out of necessity, he could get bumped into the second most targets. But to refresh everyone on who's in this wide receiver room, let's play a little bit of Steelers receiver grab bag, and I'll list a bunch of names, and you pick who you think will get the most targets out of that group, and maybe we'll leave Roman Wilson out. So we have Calvin Austin, Marquez Callaway, Des Fitzpatrick, Van Jefferson, Scotty Miller, Denzel Mims, and Quez Watkins.
So a lot of these guys are going to be out of the mix, right? Like you're not keeping more than 5
you're not going to go
6
into
is the absolute most. So I think kind of between so let's look at kind of like the slot guys. You can kind of group them together. I know Scotty Miller has played some on the outside. He's probably going to be primarily a slot receiver. Quez Watkins the same way. Then you also have Roman Wilson and Calvin Austin. Like there's just not room for 4 guys that share the same niche role on the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Wilson is a lock to make the team. I think Calvin Austin is an essential lock to make the team. And I know that might be a bold statement to some. He's the only guy that returns punts on the team. And I think that the Steelers, the fact that he's running with the starters so far in OTAs, there's a lot of factors you can look to say that this guy has a great chance of making the team and carving out a significant role. So I would expect his role to be higher than the names that you just listed, Josh. And so I think that if you're looking at that position, if you're kind of looking at that slot, I think that he could be Austin and Roman Wilson are going to be the guys that are used primarily there. I think between one of Quez Watkins and Scotty Miller, I think one of those guys doesn't make the team if we're just playing a numbers game here. On the outside, I think Van Jefferson stands a much better chance. I'm not a huge Jefferson fan. I don't think that he played particularly well last year, but you just don't have a lot of big-ish receiver types that can play on the outside. They can play a little Z and come slide into the slot, and he's got experience doing both of those things. So I think that when you look at that numbers game there, you're lacking another outside receiver for sure. Like if there was a guy in the building right now, like a Mac Hollins type, someone who can come in and fill that role of being like the special teams, like take over for Miles Boykin, I think that would almost be a roster lock type player. I just don't know if the Steelers have that player on their roster right now, even with all the names they have. Denzel Mims is not going to make the team. He's only played, I think, 3 special team snaps in his career so far. So I would be shocked if he's on the final roster. And so it comes down to a couple of guys. And this is why I think that another move is not out of the question. Could they have gone and traded for a Ben Skoranek, a guy that does play a lot of special teams and can block? Like, had they gotten a guy like that, I think he would probably grab that last receiver spot, fill the Miles Boykin role. But I think that there's potentially one outside receiver that's up for grabs still.
That's where I was going to kind of go next is if we feel that this team needs to make a significant investment in wide receiver going forward. And it's obvious that unless Roman Wilson just explodes in year 1, right, that next year they're either going to have to draft another one or sign somebody, because it just doesn't seem very viable to every year, let's throw a bunch of darts at wide receiver in free agency, 1-year contracts, see who works, and then filter them out again. Wide receiver feels like a position where you need more long-term answers, where I like the roster long-term salary cap flexibility of the quarterback position. I kind of hate it at wide receiver because there's just no clarity to what the room's going to look like going forward. And it's good that you have Pickens. Obviously, he's the answer. But it's like my premise for this game is like the offseason physical, right? The roster doctor thing. It would almost be like the assessment is they're malnourished, right? There's just not a lot there. Would you prefer big game hunting obviously maybe Brandon Ayuk's off the table. This doesn't even have to be this offseason. But like going forward, do you like the big game hunting route of a T. Higgins, a Brandon Ayuk, or whoever that is, or let Pickens be the guy and let's just supplement better and a bit more aggressively?
I think the answer, Josh, is probably somewhere in the middle of those two things. Like, I'm not trusting the answer to be just Pickens moving forward. And we talked about him and so like, I think that yes, he has 2 years left on his contract. This is kind of a contract year in my mind, because he needs to show that he can be that guy. If he doesn't, honestly, I like the strategy of investing day 2 picks into the wide receiver position. I think that's one thing that should not change under Omar Khan because of the success the Steelers have had in that area. You're getting guys that are a little bit cheaper. No, you don't get the 5th-year option, but the Steelers typically only pay one receiver at a time anyway. I think that when you're looking at resources invested, it's far less investment than, say, throwing a first-round pick into a receiver or trading a first-round pick and stomaching the double gut punch of, now I got to turn around and make this guy a $30 million wide receiver like a Brandon Ayuk. I think that's a lot harder to do, and I think you need to be in a very specific Super Bowl type window to execute moves like that. I don't think the Steelers are there yet, and I don't know if you believe that they are yet either.
I don't either. I just was talking. I opened the show talking about Patrick Queen saying he wants to win right now, and this is not a place to do that.
Yeah, and so that's my philosophy exactly. Until you find yourself in that situation where you are one like blockbuster trade move away from making that push, I think that it's best to hold off and do what you do well, like draft, develop wide receivers. You obviously get great production and good efficiency out of most of the guys that you take in the second-ish, third-ish round. And so I would continue that philosophy. They clearly need to do that again next year if you don't go out and sign a big name, because even if Roman Wilson turns out, even if George Pickens proves to be that number 1 receiver, that X receiver for the Steelers this year, you need another guy. And I don't know what Calvin Austin's going to offer. I liked him coming out of school. I obviously thought that he drew the short straw, landed on IR, didn't get to play as a rookie. And then last year with Matt Canada, didn't do much of anything outside of kind of gadgety type production. And so even if all 3 of those guys turn out, I mean, this is a passing game in today's league. And so you need another option. I would expect them, my prediction and what I want them to do kind of a line. And I think that they'll invest in a wide receiver probably in the first 2 to maybe 3 rounds in next year's draft.
That seems like the right philosophy, where it's almost like not when you have spending money burning a hole in your pocket, because it's a little different. The cap space doesn't really work that way. But the Steelers for so many years now have spent so much money on defense and nothing on offense. They're last in cap spending on offense. I feel like they could be more aggressive with hunting down a receiver, even if you're not ready for that quarterback, because it just continues to put the guys you have in a better position. And eventually whoever you get, if it's a draft pick, if it's whoever, they're ready to just hit the ground running. But again, then you're losing something, right? Obviously, you can't just, because you're not spending a lot on offense, that doesn't mean there's more cap space. But I would lean a bit more aggressive than you, but not completely. I don't think it's the right position to just like multiple first rounders for an Ayuk and give him a huge extension. It just doesn't, especially in an Arthur Smith offense without multiple targets to go around. And that brings me to another question about spending money on offense. We're going to move to the tight end room now. Do you foresee a Pat Freiermuth extension? Would you give Pat Freiermuth an extension? How do you feel about that position?
Yeah, Josh, and before I get to that, I did want to just one last quick word in there. I have no issue at all with anybody who wants the Steelers to go out and trade for a blockbuster receiver. The biggest reason why I would hold off on doing that isn't because the receiver wouldn't make a big impact. It's because I love what Omar Khan has done in the draft the last couple of years. And in parting with that draft capital is so valuable when you're finally addressing players of value, players at important positions. Like, I think that they, on paper, these last 2 years drafts, and we can look at 2023 already and the impact that it had on the field last year. I think that it's going to be a really good draft class. I think 2024 is going to be somewhat of the same. And so that would be my biggest holdoff. If this was Kevin Colbert in his last 5 years, I'd be like, go for it.
Trade every pick. Yeah, trade every pick. Don't let him hold on to it.
Yeah, Minkah was the best move that Colbert made in the final 5 years of his tenure anyway. And so that's my holdup right there. But I don't disagree that it would certainly help improve the team as well.
And I love that caveat. 1 second. I love that because one of my theories just with the Steelers right now is I've talked to you a lot about my frustration is this team doesn't have that much of a direction, right? And then all of a sudden, Omar Khan nails 2 drafts in a row. And that gives you direction because eventually just getting more good players, okay, now we're contending, right? You don't have to make a huge move. If you nail multiple drafts in a row, that just opens a window for you that wasn't open before. And Omar Khan's drafting, to me, has started to do that, has started to say, if we get a quarterback, we're actually closer than we were tricking ourselves that we were in the late Ben years or the Pickett debacle years. And then we can go to Freiermuth because that was just the one thing I wanted to add on that because I too love the way he's drafted.
Yeah, and you would be surprised how fast things can turn around. You look at like what Andy Weidel did with Howie Roseman in Philadelphia. That roster, they got it good really quickly. Jalen Hurts stepped into a great situation, and then they were able to take off and be Super Bowl competitors. And so I think that matters too. And I think that Andy Weidel deserves credit too. This is a guy that we never talk about enough, but a guy that's in charge of putting that draft board together and has all his hands. It screams everything he does. It looks just like Roseman in Philadelphia. And you saw that the Eagles take, 2 amazing cornerback prospects this year as well. So just had to get my last 2 cents in there. On Freiermuth, I think this one is so interesting to me. Like if you would ask me after his first 2 seasons, I'm like, yes, like this guy is clearly getting an extension. He deserves it. He's a borderline top 5-ish type tight end because of his pace and production. He was the first tight end, I think, in NFL history to have back-to-back receptions or 60 reception seasons to begin his NFL career. And then things kind of went downhill from there. A lot of that was out of his control, but because of the injury stuff, it's also like a hesitation to give him a contract extension. Freiermuth has a history of concussions now. He had some soft tissue injuries that he was dealing with. And it makes me wonder, how reliable is this? Can we give him this type of money and expect him to be a big part of the offense? Because I think in order to earn that contract, he's going to have a significant role. Is his role going to go forward with Arthur Smith? Is it going to take a step back? Like Smith has kind of used a committee tight end approach. We saw Kyle Pitts these past couple of years. And so
it's not always fantasy football. They know all about his
philosophy. A lot of frustrated fantasy owners there for sure. So if you're telling me that he's taking a significant step forward from what he did in his first 2 seasons, I'd say, yes, I'm all on board with the Freiermuth extension. But I think that when you factor in his injury history, the fact that his production went down, his efficiency went down, and just the uncertainty of not knowing how he's going to look in Arthur Smith's offense, like, is he just going to be an average NFL tight end? Like, is that a guy worth paying? And I think from a physical standpoint, I don't think that Freiermuth, he's not like some freaky athlete or anything. And so he can be replaced in that sense. Now, there's some things that I love about his game. Like I love his ability to reel the ball in traffic and to run after the catch with his physicality, but he's not a special athlete. So that part of his game can be replaced. It all depends on how much of a priority he's going to be in this offense. If you think he's a guy you can funnel the offense through, he's worth an extension. I honestly kind of want to see it play out because I certainly wouldn't throw like TJ Hawkinson type money at him with the injury history that he has right now. And I think there was a point where you could argue he was on that type of pace. But after last year, I would be really hesitant.
And that's what's so frustrating about the Matt Canada experience for 2 years. Like not even just watching it and in a game, it gives you a less of a chance to win. It makes it so hard to evaluate what the hell you have on your roster. Because what is Freiermuth, right? He gobbled up targets from Ben in his last year when it was all short throws and getting it out of his hand. And he's perfect for that. But when you have these deep ball passers now who are completely different in a completely different offense, how do you really evaluate that player? One of my points on Freiermuth is it feels like he's injury prone now. And that's kind of the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
He's played
Yeah.
16, 16, and 12 in his 3 years. So he's, for a tight end, a physical position, that's a lot of games, and that's fairly reliable. It comes back to the same issue of eventually you have to invest in offense.
Yeah.
And maybe Freiermuth isn't that right guy. You can't just spend money to spend it. But at some point, I feel like the Steelers have to have somebody locked up on this offense. We don't know what it's going to look like in 2025. There are almost no players under contract, especially skill players and quarterback and everything. It could look completely different if it's a disaster this year. And that scares me.
Yeah, and for that reason, I can get behind the extension, because when you look into the future and say you have to have something there, obviously you can structure the contract in a way to say, all right, we can get out of this in 2 years if we need to, and something better comes along. So I get that for sure. My question is right now, based on what we saw of Freiermuth last year, can he stay on the field? Because yes, even with 12 games in those 16 games in the year prior, that's not even counting the times that he left the field early with concussions or pulled his hamstring and he had to leave the game. And so just far too much of that type of stuff, which that's the biggest reason I'd be hesitant. It's not even off the talent, but the inability to maybe play out a full game. And so I think that that's a factor. And then again, how is he going to be used in the offense? Am I going to pay that much money to a tight end if I'm not planning on using him? If he's a guy that's going to get 45 catches a year, I mean, I think that's replacement level stuff. So the offense needs to become a priority. And I 100% agree with you there. The defense is the highest paid in the league this year, cap number wise. The offense needs to flip the script a little bit there, but it also has to align with where the talent is as well. Now, I'm not saying he's this player, but I hated the Larry Ogunjobi extension. Like, I don't think that guy ever deserved to get 3 years, $28.75 million, but the Steelers had some money. They didn't want to create a hole in their defensive line. And so what they did is they paid him, seeing what other guys were going for in free agency. They kind of bit the bullet and just stuck with him. I think it looks like a bad contract. I don't think he played very well last year. And I think that for the most part, Ogunjobi is a replacement level starter that you can get for half that price. So I don't want that to be the case with Freiermuth. And I do think that Pat is more talented than that in respect to his position. But I would worry a little bit if he can't stay on the field, or if he's not used heavily in Arthur Smith's offense, where it'd be like, all right, why are we paying this guy $12 million a year, whatever ends up being in that contract? That would be my hesitation. But I agree that focus needs to shift back to the offense, and offensive guys need to start getting paid. If you always keep it on the defensive side and you're always cycling through guys on rookie contracts or mid-level free agents, you'll never have a strong enough offense to compete.
Somebody that's going to be on the field, but like we were talking about, what's Freiermuth's production level, involvement level in the offense going to be? It doesn't really matter what Darnell Washington's target share is, because he's not that type of player. Do we like the fit with him? Because I think it's a match made in heaven in a run-heavy offense. Arthur Smith wants to pound the rock. You have an extra offensive lineman essentially out there. That's why I love the Washington draft pick in the first place. It felt like great value. Last year, it was unremarkable, but that's just kind of the nature of a blocking tight end.
Yeah, I'm not giving up on Washington by any stretch of the imagination. And I think the same can be said for everybody that was a part of that Matt Canada offense. They're just not utilized in the best way possible. And so I was a big fan of Washington coming out. I know a lot of people were. Obviously, you look at like the consensus board, where he ranked and where the Steelers were able to get him. The value was like the biggest discrepancy of any player that was drafted when you get him at the end of the third round, and a guy that some people had in the 20s. And so I don't think that he's going to be that guy. I don't think that he's going to be the joker tight end, or the one that you can just funnel your offense through. He's not going to be a big target hog. He's going to be the inline Y blocking tight end. And that's okay. I think there's a role for that guy for sure. Now, looking at Arthur Smith's offense, he's kind of used a variety of guys. He likes kind of the H-back types too, the Michael Pruitts, even the Connor Hayward types, where he can get those guys.
That's exactly where we're going next.
Blocking. And I think that Washington, that's an area he needs to improve, is engaging in those blocks in space a little bit better than he did last year. Season was kind of up and down, but again, he was a 21-year-old rookie. I expect him to make big strides in his second season. He does not lack in the length and strength department for sure. So if he can get engaged I expect the block to go well in his favor. So I would expect a significant improvement in year 2.
You said you loved the Washington pick. How much I
Mhm.
love the Washington pick is I was drunk at a bar in Virginia where I went to college, and my out for my friend's birthday at an Irish bar, having a nice black and blue, a Blue Moon Guinness concoction, and immediately put in a Steelers Super Bowl bet. After that, it was Keanu Benton was the pick before, and then we got Washington,
Yeah.
and I was like, that's it. We fixed Omar Khan fixed it in 1 year. So that's how high I was on Washington in the moment. We'll go next to, well, first, do you have any massive overreaction moments like that? Do you have a favorite one that just like your fandom kicked in and you were like,
Mhm.
this is my guy. We're going to win everything.
I think Washington was one of them, honestly. You're talking about a 6'7", 270-pound tight end that moved the way he did at the combine and tested as a 99th percentile athlete and came from a Georgia football program. I think there was so much to like about that. I think the 23 draft class in general, though, like Nick Herbig, I thought the value was great.
Loved it.
And Herbig looks like he could be that pass rush specialist already. So no, I definitely have my moments of overreaction as well. So yeah, some better than others for sure.
I just started showing people the video of him pushing the sled at the combine. I was like, watch this, like just how easily he moved it. I was like, this
Yeah.
guy's a monster. So we'll get to Connor Hayward really quickly because we got to get
Mhm.
to the running back room before I let you go. Do you see him having a role? Because I like what Connor Hayward can do. And there were
Mhm.
interesting ways that he was utilized throughout his first 2 years, but I don't know, like, I just don't know what he is. So I guess I'm asking what is Connor Hayward?
Yeah, I do think he has a role. And to answer the second part of that question, I don't know exactly what that role is going to be. But I think if we look at things, again, we go back to the numbers game. The Steelers don't have a true fullback that is projected to make the roster. I think that means there's room for a fourth tight end, right? So Hayward and perhaps even Michael Pruitt make the roster together. I don't think that that's out of the question. So I think that Hayward has a role as the H-back type. I think he can do some fullback type stuff. I think that his role is still going to be very baseline, especially if Freiermuth is healthy and Darnell Washington takes a step forward. It's kind of just looking at Smith's offenses in the past. A lot of, very 12 personnel, 13 personnel heavy. You're going to do a lot of that type of stuff. And so I think that there is room for him on the roster. And I think that he makes the final roster for sure.
The running back room. We'll just take a look at what it is. I jumped into it a little
Mhm.
bit off of the LaMichael Pirine signing. Not that that's big news, but I felt like it was an interesting lens to kind of look at the Najee Harris situation. He's, part of that running back revolution, right? He wants running backs to get paid, and he didn't. He didn't get the fifth-year option picked up. How
Yeah.
disgruntled is he going to be? How's that going to work? Are you on the Warren or the Harris side of things? We'll start there.
You're asking the minority here, and I am on the Jaylen Warren side of things because to me, running backs, now I know that Najee's explosive play rate went up last year. However, he was barely breaching that 20-yard threshold. A lot of those were well-blocked plays. I think that inarguably, Jaylen Warren the last 2 years has been a more efficient running back. And I think that if you give that guy a crease, he's going to do more with it than what Najee's going to do. It's just plain and simple. I don't care about your past draft status. It does not matter to me. No, I don't think the Steelers should invest first-round picks in running back, but that's a different story entirely. If he was worth that, then that's fine. That's a different story. But if just comparing them apples to apples, I think that Jaylen Warren is better in most facets of the game, including the receiving game, which I think is also a big part of it. So I think that when you're looking at that, I know a lot of people were up in arms about the Najee decision. I actually don't mind it. I actually wrote an article applauding Khan for doing just that because he's looking ahead to the future and he's saying this running back that has, I can't remember. I had all these numbers in my head just a little bit ago. I'm pushing like 2,000 carries since college. This running back that they have, who is going to be 27 years old by the 2025 season. It's going to have a lot of wear and tear on the tires. I mean, Warren legitimately has a third of the touches of Najee Harris going back to his college days, and he is notably more explosive than Harris. I think when you look ahead and say, all right, if we only want to pay one of these guys the following year, Warren, I mean, it's Warren hands down. I think it's really hard to make a case not to do that for him. And so, yes, theoretically you could have both Najee and Warren under contract for the 2025 season. I would go as far to say, Josh, that maybe you can go out and spend a mid-round pick and get a running back that will match that efficiency, and you'll get him for several $100,000 instead of the $6.78 million or whatever the fifth-year option price was. I'm not a big, I wasn't hard one way or the other. I could have seen that going either way. I would have been fine with it going either way. So I'm not in that camp, but Warren over Najee, if I had to pick one right now, the decision is pretty easy.
I'm exactly with you. So I've been a Warren advocate since first seeing him take the field. I'm not a Najee Harris guy. You mentioned the explosive run numbers. I was digging into it before this, and I was a little bit surprised. Like, Najee has a bit more than I remember of those, 15 plus yard runs, things like that, but not the big ones. I think his longest run last year was still something like 24 yards. Like, he's just not a home run hitter, and that's not the type of guy you should be paying. I don't really think you should be paying running backs unless they're true difference makers, the Christian McCaffrey types, the whatever. A similar situation, obviously this year it's going to be a split. It's going to be similar to last year. We know Arthur Smith likes a big bruiser, and he can't keep Warren off the field. So I anticipate it being a similar situation. Going forward, there was a good example, a test case for this with a first-round running back who's a bigger, more physical guy being the number one, and then the backup that everyone loved. It was in Dallas. Tony Pollard last year became the number one and couldn't really handle it. Different player, lighter player, Warren more physical, more filled out in his frame. So he probably won't have those same issues with injuries or whatever Pollard did. But do you see Warren as the traditional Mike Tomlin feature back beyond the Harris era once he's on his own? Because that's what Tomlin's MO was for so long, is we have one running back, he gets all the carries, and then maybe we'll spell him every once in a while. Do you think Warren can be that guy? Because I think he can.
Well, first of all, I think that the parallel you're drawing there between Dallas and Pittsburgh is perfect. It's spot on because the situations are so similar there. Secondly, I think that Warren can do it. I think that he's got the small compact frame where he can handle that workload. However, I would argue that I don't think that teams should do it that much anymore. I think that teams should have a committee approach. When you get guys out there and they're fresh and you're only giving them 12 to 15 touches a game instead of 20 to 25 carries a game, that you're going to allow him to last longer, not wear down quite so fast. You can be fresher if you are to make the postseason. So I think there's a lot of advantages of having a committee backfield in some sense, at least. Now, maybe that looks like after the Najee era, maybe it's 60% touches for Warren and the other 40% to the second and third string running back, whatever you have there. But I think that there's advantages of doing that, especially when you don't have that Christian McCaffrey guy that's just like, this guy's too good that he can never come off the field. I think that Warren's really good. I would go as far as to say maybe he's a top 7 or 9 running back in the league. Come at me with this, because efficiency wise, it's really hard to argue that he hasn't been in that department. But maybe that efficiency does go down though if you overwork him. And so I actually kind of want to keep him as part of a committee. And I don't know who the next guy would be to pair with him after Najee, but I think that you could get by. And again, the offensive line and the scheme matter so much for this, that you get what's blocked for you in most cases. That's just how it is for most running backs. So if the Steelers fix their offensive line woes in their running game, their game plan, it turns out proves to be good, you can go out and spend a 3rd or 4th round pick on a running back, get 4 years out of him. You can use and abuse him and throw him on the pile and get another one. Like, I hate that that's the way that it is, but I mean, these are running backs in today's NFL. It's not a position that you should spend high draft picks on. It's not a position you should spend a lot of money on. And in fact, all of the Super Bowl winners over the last, can't remember how many, 6 or 7 years, have had such little investment at the running back position. They hardly pay the guys that they've won Super Bowls with. And so I think that the evidence at this stage, Josh, is overwhelming that running backs should be a small investment. But if I'm going with one, go with Warren over Harris because of significantly less wear and tear, what he's got left in the tank, and then pair him with another guy who can ease his workload a little bit so you're not overworking him.
My philosophy for the running back position for the Steelers situation specifically is almost exactly like what you said for wide receiver. Like just
Okay.
next year, pick one in the 3rd round, pick one in
Mhm.
the 4th round. That's still even a little higher than what some people want to invest in a running back. But I think there's a lot of value in getting those talented players, even in the 2nd round. I don't mind it.
Yeah.
But when you're going into the 1st round, that's just not a good way to allocate your resources. And it's not a way I see Omar Khan ever building out his roster. So that brings us to the question of the kind of to play into the shtick even
Mhm.
more. What is your diagnosis of the skill positions? However you'd like to interpret that question. What is your
Okay.
kind of long-term diagnosis of the health of this team, salary cap wise and talent wise?
I think they're sitting fairly well overall. And if you go by position here, I think the top 3 running backs are already locked in. You could have done it as soon as the Steelers signed Cordero Patterson. Now that Patterson's not a long-term fix, but he's going to be the return man this year. So it's for me, if we're looking at the running back position specifically, it's hard for me to get excited about Jonathan Ward, Aaron Shamklin, and P. Ryan. Like those guys just don't excite me, knowing that the 3 running backs they have are the guys that are going to be there. Jalen Warren, Najee Harris, and Cordero Patterson. It's good for now. They'll need something again in the future. And like you said, I'm not opposed to spending a 2nd round pick on a running back. If it's a guy that's good enough that you can get 4 good years out of before you have to draft and replace again, I can get behind that as well. So I think that is the position is more than good enough for now, and we'll need some look in the future. The wide receiver position, we both agree that they're shorthanded there. They need another guy. I think that Steelers Nation knows that. I like Roman Wilson a lot. I like George Pickens a lot. Even if those guys turn out, they need another player in that wide receiver room and someone to give them a boost. If Pickens proves not to be a wide receiver 1, then you need an even higher investment, unfortunately, there. And then tight end, I love what they have going on in the overall outlook. I think that I'm very curious about the situation because of the Pat Freiermuth entering a contract year now to see what he's got and what he'll offer. But I do like Darnell Washington, and I think that that's a room that can be fixed relatively easily.
The word that I stumbled into earlier of malnourished is, I think, the one that I'm sticking with
Okay.
because there is good stuff there, but it's just not enough for me going
Mm-hmm.
forward. Long term, I worry about the state of the offense because you're just putting yourself in a position where you're constantly cycling in new guys and you're going to miss on somebody, right? If you never lock up a wide receiver, eventually one of your 2nd round picks misses and then you're stuck, right? You only have one guy,
Yeah.
whatever that is. So I just want more commitment from the front office. I don't want to commit to the wrong guys because that ends you in the Larry Ogunjobi contract where as soon as you sign it, you don't feel good about it. So I don't want to overreact to that. I just feel like we're lacking something on the offensive skill positions. So that's ultimately where I land.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I think that they need something specifically at the wide receiver position. I think that's where they need the most help overall. There's the most uncertainty there. You've got some upside, but a lot of uncertainty, and you're banking on health a lot. Like George Pickens has to stay healthy. I would go as far to say that Roman Wilson probably has to stay healthy because I think he's going to be that maybe the second biggest receiving option at the wide receiver position this year. There's just not a lot of guys that can manage that role there.
Tommy, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun chopping it up and me getting to ask you some questions instead of the other way around. So it's been a lot of fun. Thank you for coming on.
I appreciate it, Josh. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. All right. That's our show, everybody. Thank you for listening and, of course, subscribing, everything that you want to do. Check out Tommy's show tomorrow, of course, with Shane. They do great stuff. Excited to hear what you have going on tomorrow, Tommy. And a huge thank you for you listening. And we'll talk next week. Go Steelers.